So Jake is a postdoctoral fellow in bioethics, and he did his postdoc at the National Institute of Health Clinical Centre and has worked as a hospital ethicist, which would be very interesting. I'm presuming you'll take on that journey. And you've got a particular interest, which is very topical in the US, and that's procreation, parenthood, biomedical research and innovation. So over to you, Jake. Thank you very much. We're very interested in your juxtaposition of ethics and integrity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here. Let me pull up my slides. So as I was introduced, I'm Jake Earl. I'm a philosopher. There will be quite a bit of philosophy in this presentation, and bioethicist with the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research. Today I'm beaming into you from Washington, D.C. It's actually Thanksgiving Day. As of about an hour ago, that's when we Americans gather to drink and bicker with our families over the carcass of an ugly, usually exceedingly dry bird. But enough bragging. I'm excited to speak to you today about a conceptual approach to thinking about research ethics, research integrity, the relationship between them, and how this can be relevant for folks who think and work in research with human subjects. I'm not representing my company or the policies or positions of any part of the United States government, and I don't have any conflicts of interest to declare. So lots of stakeholders in the research enterprise bandy about terms like research ethics, research integrity, responsible research, responsible conduct of research, responsible and ethical conduct of research, good research practice, best research practice, and others. What do these stakeholders mean when they use these terms? Today, I want to consider and address three key questions about two of the most common of these terms, research ethics and research integrity, that will address some of the others as well. First, what do these various stakeholders mean by these terms? Second, apart from how the terms are actually used by these stakeholders, what should they mean? And finally, what implications do these terms have for the oversight of research with human subjects? We'll start with a bit of history. I was happy to see this presentation was placed in a session called International Perspectives, since that provides me with a little bit of cover for the fact that much of the presentation will focus on the US context. That's probably shocking that an American presenter is overlooking international perspectives on an issue, but here we are. So in the United States, the term research integrity emerged from discussions of major revelations of fraud and deception from prominent researchers, typically those who had received significant government funding. In the early years, the term was used as a generic to distinguish from research misconduct, a set of behaviors that were prohibitable and punishable under regulation and policy. Since that time, various government bodies, scholars of research integrity, research ethics, and responsible conduct of research have struggled to settle on a shared understanding of the idea of research integrity or of research ethics. Research integrity has been defined in terms of the use of honest methods, personal responsibility and commitment to best practices, adherence to professional standards and regulations, a personal understanding of ethical norms, or some type of deep commitment to scientific values in one's actions and one's attitudes. While research ethics is used by bioethicists and those who work in human or animal research subjects oversight to describe their areas of concern, others have struggled to clearly distinguish research ethics from research integrity and related terms. I personally enjoy Kenneth Pimple's candid commentary on the relationship between research ethics and responsible conduct of research. He says, quote, "I have not yet been able to discern a meaningful difference between the two terms, but RCR is clearly becoming the term in favor. Perhaps it is preferred because some prefer the word ethics as being too preachy, judgmental, moralistic, or abstract." Amen, I guess. Unfortunately, and all too often, attempts to define research integrity or research ethics, or both, or to explain the relationship between them often descends into a kind of value-laden word salad with fuzzy relationships among terms like responsibility, trust, excellence, standards, character, commitment, compliance, honesty, and of course, integrity. It seems like the primary agreement among researchers, administrators, government officials, and segments of the public concerned with research integrity and or research ethics is that these terms track something important enough to merit our attention and that they require some type of intervention. You might be thinking to yourself, should we really be bothered by this? The gist of all these terms and definitions is that researchers need to do a better job, and a bit of messiness about their exact meaning doesn't distract from their importance. There's definitely something to that objection, but I think it overlooks some real consequences for this terminological uncertainty and confusion. One problem is that the interchangeable use of various terms can lead to minimization of the concerns they're meant to identify. In discussions with researchers, Shaw and Saddlecar 2018 found that scientists thought that research integrity meant merely a lack of research misconduct, defined as falsification, fabrication, or plagiarism. Psychological minimization like this is easier to do when there's a lack of clarity about the meanings of these terms. Another problem is that confusion about value terms like these begets confusion about how individuals and institutions should realize these values. For example, if research integrity is the absence of fraudulent behavior in researchers, then it makes sense to set up rules prohibiting behaviors and punishing violations. But if research integrity is a set of virtues possessed by researchers, then trying to impose external rules with appropriate punishments for violations would likely be an ineffective way to promote research integrity, since you don't have to be virtuous to get why you want to avoid being punished. A related problem is that uncertainty about the meaning of these value terms begets uncertainty about what type of individual or organizational actor should be accountable for realizing those values. Committees tasked with protecting the rights and welfare of human participants in research seem to play one important role in promoting something like research ethics or research integrity, but could they do more? Could they be organized in the same offices tasked with combating research misconduct or promoting responsible conduct more broadly? Yet another problem is that these terms, if these terms are left undefined, they can be co-opted in ways that are counterproductive or even ethically dubious. In the United States, recent concerns about scientific competition and protection of intellectual property from nations like China has led to initiatives to promote quote unquote research security, including stricter export controls of scientific data and materials and monitoring of conflicts of interest or commitment with foreign institutions or entities. Several of these initiatives have generated controversy. They rope scientific exchange into international and domestic partisan politics. They potentially stigmatize researchers with certain national or ethnic backgrounds. Advocates of these interventions have defended research security measures as essential for research ethics, research integrity, and responsible conduct of research. This makes sense if these terms denote compliance with rules imposed by researchers by legitimate authorities, but more plausibly, this is worrisome and a potentially inappropriate co-opting of these important value terms. When scholars have tried to define and systematize these terms, they've generally run into problems. I'm going to briefly canvass some of the better known approaches to defining research integrity and research ethics and explain why they're not particularly satisfying. I call these three broad approaches conventionalism, maximalism, and moralism. Conventionalist approaches define research ethics or integrity in terms of rules or norms established by researchers themselves or by discrete social entities concerned with the practice of research, such as governments, professional societies, or research institutions. Scholar Nicholas Stenek endorses a conventionalist definition of research integrity as, quote, possessing and steadfastly adhering to professional standards as outlined by professional organizations, research institutions, and when relevant, government and public. Materials promulgated by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office of Research Integrity generally use the term research integrity interchangeably with responsible conduct of research, which in many documents concerns the range of accepted practices for conducting research. There are two key problems with conventionalist approaches to defining research integrity or research ethics. First, it gets the direction of explanation backward. Laws, regulations, policies, accepted practices for research should be followed because they promote values of ethics and integrity in research and should be resisted and reformed when they fail to do so. So you can't explain what research integrity is simply by pointing to rules and practices that claim to embody it. You have to give reasons for thinking that these rules or practices in fact promote or ensure these values. Second, a conventionalist approach offers no resources for resolving controversies over the ethics or integrity of research practices. Many of you will be familiar with the historical and ongoing controversies about the ethics of placebo controls in research with human participants, especially populations from lower middle income countries. Pointing to this or that practice, standard, or law is inadequate to resolve these controversies precisely because those are what disputants are contesting the value and relevance of. So without a realist view of what research integrity or research ethics requires, we lack a position from which to critique or improve current practices. Maximalist approaches define research ethics or research integrity in ways that approximate maximally ideal practices in science, such that any shortcoming in practice is potentially an ethics or integrity issue. While not often explicitly endorsed, a maximalist approach to research ethics or integrity can be seen in multiple reports on the topics from government, scholars, NGOs, which seem to address every concern about the enterprise, everything maybe but the break room or laboratory sink. Codes or standards aimed at promoting research integrity address different types of concerns, ranging from protecting the rights and welfare of research subjects to ensuring conducive research environments to the use of specific data coding formats or particular procedures for investigating allegations of research misconduct. Many documents include a resource stewardship as a research ethics or integrity value without qualification or limitation, leaving open the possibility that any waste, a pencil used inappropriately, is some type of violation or failing of research ethics or integrity. The problem with maximalism is that it puts all concerns we might have about the efficiency, productivity, quality, documentability, or even pleasantness of the research enterprise within the same category, such that any violation or shortcoming in these areas is a failure of ethics or a violation of integrity. This isn't merely an odd way of using serious terms like integrity or ethics. It can diminish the importance and usefulness of these terms. The claim that a researcher or study is unethical or lacks integrity in some respect is a serious statement, and definitions of this term should capture that seriousness. Lastly, moralist approaches define research ethics or integrity in terms of individual or institutional virtue or moral goodness, often by subsuming integrity under ethics or ethics under integrity. Various commentators appeal to the etymology of the term integrity as a type of, quote, moral wholeness or consistency as justification for subsuming the idea of research ethics under the idea of research integrity. Official bodies and commentators appear to draw on this approach when they specify research integrity in terms of the appropriate virtues or professional identities of researchers, such as the virtues of honesty, accountability, objectiveness, fairness, respect, and so on. There are two problems with the moralist approaches to defining research integrity and research ethics. First, like maximalism, conflating the two terms ignores the intuitive, practical, and conceptual distinctiveness of moral and ethical values from some other types of values. If I fail to adhere to some norm or demonstrate some virtue appropriate to a profession or activity, I can be condemned as a professional or participant in the activity. For instance, if I consistently break the rules or customs of footy, then I'm a bad footy player. At least my actions are bad in the footy sense. But if I consistently break ethical rules or fail to realize moral virtues, I'm not just bad or condemnable in this or that respect. I'm bad as a person. I'm condemnable overall. This gives us a strong intuitive reason not to subsume the idea, if not the terminology, of moral or ethical concerns in research versus other sorts of concerns, even concerns about integrity. Second, there are reasons to resist framing research ethics or research integrity in terms of moral virtues. First, it's not clear that what we really care about is whether researchers or research institutions are virtuous, provided that we get the results that we want from scientific research. For example, there have been recent efforts to apply artificial intelligence and machine learning systems to formulate and investigate research hypotheses. This raises the possibility that significant portions of the research enterprise will one day be turned over to machines. Now, assuming that the results of such research are reliable and useful and that the rights and welfare of those affected by the research are protected, it's hard to see what objection we would have to offloading scientific research onto AI/ML systems. Notice, though, that this scientific research would totally lack in virtue, since these systems would not have patterns of thought and feeling that are definitive of moral virtues in the ordinary sense. This suggests that we might not care much about virtues as long as research produces the right kind of results. The second reason to resist focusing on the virtues of researchers or moralizing research integrity is that it presumes that the challenges and solutions to threats to the quality of and success of scientific research fundamentally lie with individuals, rather than with the systems of institutional incentives in which those individuals live and work. Surely some problems in scientific research should be addressed by educating and improving the behaviors of individual researchers, but there's ample evidence that institutional reforms are needed to address major problems in scientific research, such as failures of reproducibility and replicability. So we need clear definitions of research integrity and research ethics, and the problems with extant approaches is that they can give us some criteria on what those definitions should look like. Good definitions would give us resources for critiquing current standards and practices. They would let us draw intuitive distinctions between more or less serious problems in research. They would be distinctive enough to allow for the special kind of badness or of moral or ethical failings in research. Building from these criteria, I'm proposing the following as a result of conceptual analysis and looking at the literature on these topics, a way to think about defining research ethics and research integrity. So first, the terms research integrity and research ethics refer to distinct sets of objective norms, standards that apply generally to individual and institutional actors and do not depend on recognition or promulgation of specific rules or codes by institutions or societies. If you're skeptical about the idea of objective norms, consider whether it's ever ethical to boil a baby to death for fun, and whether that's an objective norm. You probably think it is. Or whether there's an objective norm that it's irrational to drink poison at a party if you have no interest in dying at a party. Similarly, that seems to be objective. Second, these norms apply to the essential practices of scientific research, which are those practices that are necessary for producing scientific knowledge across different social, historical, and institutional contexts. For instance, there might be a great deal of cultural or institutional variation in how new researchers are trained in the latest methods, but the training of new scientific researchers to eventually replace old researchers is an essential practice for the production of scientific knowledge, regardless of specific context. Third, these objective norms are consequentialist or outcomes focused. Their satisfaction does not require that agents, whether individuals or institutions, have specific motives, beliefs, attitudes, or values. If we replaced all human researchers with artificial intelligence systems, the objective norms would still apply to the work that these systems perform, even if these systems can't be said to have character, motives, beliefs, attitudes, or even virtues of their own. What distinguishes research ethics and research integrity then if they have these features in common? The key difference is that these terms refer to distinct and non-overlapping sets of objective norms. Research ethics refers to the set of norms that are essential for protecting the rights and interests of individuals affected by the practice of scientific research. Norms of research ethics are grounded in non-instrumental moral values, and therefore they are external to scientific practice. Research integrity refers to the set of norms that are essential for producing scientific knowledge over time, including development of scientific theory and understanding of empirical phenomena through research. Norms of research integrity are grounded in instrumental, constitutive values of scientific practice, and therefore are internal to science itself. Norms of research integrity apply to all parties engaged in scientific research and have no authority over anyone not engaged in that practice. To see how this conceptual schema can be useful, and with any luck more useful than the alternative approaches we considered a few moments ago, let's look at some cases. Consider a hypothetical case of disputed authorship of a scientific publication, a classic challenge for responsible conduct of research. Miriam is a PhD student who has been working with a human factors research team at an academic medical center. In addition to conducting research for her dissertation, Miriam led a project to develop and test a new checklist to reduce errors in medications provided to patients when discharged. The human factors research director, Dr. Kimitai, assisted Miriam with refining the checklist, setting up a pilot study in 2 units, and assisting with drafting and revising the manuscript. Because Miriam is going on an extended family vacation, Dr. Kimitai volunteers to be the corresponding author and submits their manuscript to a scientific journal. Months later, the journal contacts Miriam and Dr. Kimitai to notify them that their manuscript has been accepted, pending minor modifications. Miriam's thrilled until she looks more closely and notices that the manuscript has an additional unexpected author, one Dr. Berger. Miriam immediately calls Dr. Kimitai to ask what happened. He says that he added Dr. Berger, an influential former colleague of his, because he gave Dr. Kimitai helpful advice about the project at an early stage. Sensing that Miriam is distraught, Dr. Kimitai assures her, "I'm sorry for the last-minute surprise, but really, this is how this kind of thing works, and it will be good for the paper's impact factor." Using our conceptual approach, we can helpfully distinguish different types of problems with this scenario. In terms of research integrity, it is likely the case that this violates objective norms for essential practice of attribution of scientific work, as Dr. Berger was not meaningfully involved in the effort reported in the publication. This impairs the ability of other stakeholders in the research enterprise to understand how the project was conducted, creates a risk that stakeholders will misjudge Dr. Berger's expertise in the future, and potentially leads to inefficiencies in the distribution of scientific resources. These are concerning to the extent that one cares about the success of scientific research, and such concerns are not fully mitigated if Dr. Kimitai is correct that this is common practice within the field. On the research ethics side, similar facts have a different significance. Although this questionable authorship assignment does not threaten the rights or interests of study participants, it plausibly shows objectionable disrespect for Miriam and potentially undermines her professional interests and in turn her well-being. The risk that this will lead to some maldistribution in research funding is also a research ethics concern, given that researchers compete for limited resources, and so considerations of fairness in their pursuit of the good apply. And general public interests are also at stake if the maldistribution were to minimize the social or health value of future research. Note that the ethical concerns about this case overlap with the integrity concerns on the matter of maldistribution of research funding, but the ethical norms at stake concern fairness and social benefit, whereas the integrity norms at stake concern the efficiency and productivity of scientific research. Let's consider a more grave real-world case. During World War II, researchers with the Imperial Japanese military conducted numerous biomedical experiments with civilians and prisoners of war in occupied China. These prisoners were subjected to intentional exposure with deadly diseases, harmful biological materials in the form of dirty bombs, and extreme weather conditions, such as those that cause frostbite of the hands and feet. Over the course of years, thousands of prisoners died, sometimes even by vivisection, or those who survived were physically and psychologically wounded. Despite these egregious harms, several of these research efforts used state-of-the-art scientific methods, generating useful data for civilian and military applications. In order to obtain access to these data, the US and the Allies made deals with the researchers and refrained from prosecuting them or publicizing their actions after the war. While some conceptual approaches would say that all of this research violated norms of research integrity, the one I'm advocating for would not, at least not necessarily. While most, if not all, of the human subject research conducted by the Imperial Japanese at places like Unit 731 was deeply unethical due to its flagrant disregard for the rights and welfare of subjects, the question of its research integrity is not so clear. One might object here and point out that the research was scientifically useless because it would be unethical to use the data collected, or because such practices of research would not be sustained in a just society. But these raise external considerations, ethical considerations that are not essential to the conduct of scientific research across times and cultures. In a sufficiently unethical and repressive society, the data from much of this research could be used to great effect. But this seems right. Our objections to this research is not as scientific research, but as an activity that unjustifiably killed and maimed human beings. That's a difference worth noting, and the conceptual approach advocated for here tracks that. So how can this conceptual distinction between research integrity and research ethics be useful for the oversight of research with human subjects, the payoff for those of you here today? First, I think it brings some clarity to some of the key tasks bodies charged with the oversight of human subject research have, namely, to ensure adherence to ethical norms concerning the rights and well-being of people involved as participants in research, while balancing consideration of the rights and well-being of human beings not involved as participants, especially including potential beneficiaries of the knowledge to be gained from research. What we call research ethics boards are not alone in this task, of course, but their primary focus is justifiably on research ethics rather than research integrity concerns. Second, the definition of research integrity as referring to objective instrumental norms for the successful generation of scientific knowledge helps to rationalize or justify why external oversight is necessary in the first place. Appealing to internal norms or logic of scientific research itself plausibly would be insufficient to identify all relevant ethical concerns about the use of human beings in such research. So, special expertise and input in the form of oversight bodies seems to be appropriate. Third, as others have argued, although human subject research oversight officials are primarily concerned with the rights and interests of study participants balanced against those of the wider society, considerations of research integrity do still play a crucial role. The reason is that shortcomings in adherence to instrumental norms for central research practices directly reduce the expected social value of research. For instance, if, as a result of disorganization of a research unit, their studies are unlikely to be widely disseminated for use by the rest of the scientific community, this violation of research integrity norms also has ethical consequences, in that their data are unlikely to yield any meaningful social benefits, meaning that study participants who are subjected to risks and burdens in their studies were subjected to those risks and burdens unjustifiably. For research that enrolls altruistically motivated, violation of research integrity norms can also lead to disrespect for their autonomy, as many such individuals enroll in studies on the assumption that they will yield meaningful, substantial social value, and a lack of research integrity threatens that outcome. The final consideration raises some important questions about the organization of institutional efforts to protect and promote the rights of well-being of human participants in research. Traditionally, such efforts have largely been siloed within institutions that support such research, and often largely separated from those institutions' other efforts to promote research integrity or responsible conduct of research, with the exception of maybe a lecture here or there within a responsible conduct of research course on human research protections. But if adherence to research integrity norms is crucial for ensuring ethically justified treatment of study participants, then this state of affairs would seem to need a rethink. Institutional human research protection programs should be concerned with the improvement of essential practices of scientific research within their institutions and across institutions. For example, Barbara Redmond and Art Kaplan have argued that human research oversight needs standard approaches for responding to findings or even credible accusations of falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism when the research involves human subjects. And often they don't have standardized procedures for dealing with or following up on these concerns and how they affect human subjects. Bioethicists such as Alex John Lungen and Jonathan Kimmelman have argued that improved coordination across research portfolios and institutions is sorely needed to effectively assess the balance of risks and benefits of different types of clinical research, largely because the expected scientific value of a single clinical trial, say a trial of a novel drug, is contingent on results of other trials within a drug portfolio. So understanding the risks and benefits imposed on subjects and whether they're justified and balanced against the potential benefits to the broader community depends on key information about the overall scientific quality of not just that particular trial, but other trials conducted using the same drug or similar drugs. So these questions are a bit beyond the scope of this presentation, however, but happy to discuss in Q&A. What do I hope for you to take away from this section? First, the landscape of research ethics, research integrity, and cognate terms like responsible conduct of research is just a real conceptual mess. So proceed with caution when you find people or organizations using these terms. Second, I've described one approach to defining research integrity and research ethics and how to distinguish them from each other. These terms refer to objective, consequentialist standards or norms that apply to essential practices of scientific research, but there are different kinds of norms. Research integrity refers to instrumental norms for the successful production of scientific knowledge, while research ethics refers to non-instrumental moral norms concerning the rights and well-being of individuals affected by scientific research. And finally, research ethics, research integrity, and their intersection do have important implications for current efforts to oversee research with human subjects and raise provocative questions about the appropriate scope and placement of those efforts within and across research institutions. I want to thank you so much for your time and attention. I look forward to discussing these issues with you further in Q&A.
Jake, that was absolutely fantastic, and I'm wondering why I didn't do philosophy. It was absolutely fascinating. I was just wondering, I mean, I know you've got, it's a concept of your two definitions of research ethics and research integrity. I was wondering, are you actually going to utilize it, or have you utilized it to look at some integrity issues and see if it would work? Would your concept and definitions work to make it easier to assess?
it's a great question. Just a bit of background on this project. The reason that I came up with this with my team at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research is that my background is in bioethics, so I'm very familiar with the research ethics from that perspective. Clinical research ethics, that was my bread and butter. I came into this institution, our team had responsibilities related to research integrity and responsible conduct of research, in addition to my own background of bioethics. So coming into the institution, we needed to build a new program, and we needed to figure out, well, what are these things? How do we explain the difference between research ethics and research integrity? What's been really helpful about this type of division, keeping these separate, is that we do a better job, I think, communicating with stakeholders about what's at stake, what's at issue with a given concern. Now, as I said in the example involving authorship, in many cases, the types of issues that researchers face on a day-to-day basis involve both ethical concerns and integrity concerns. Being able to parse those out can really help them deal with these problems, can really help them focus on what is the problem of greater concern. Some of them don't want to deal with the ethics concerns. They say, well, this person, I have a bad relationship with them. But from the integrity angle, that's something that I can use to communicate and to advocate for myself and my team. So we found that this division is helpful both for organizing our own work, with educating, with offering consultation and support, with developing policy, with finding expertise within the institution, and for giving researchers themselves the tools to identify the source of problems and to identify potentially appropriate solutions.
I'll certainly be looking at that with a view of actually implementing that as a project. Interesting. I think we've got a few questions, if you don't mind. I don't know if you can see them, actually. Jake, can you see the questions?
I can.
Yeah.
I can. So let me ask with the anonymous attendee, is anyone else disturbed by the question being posed that the research might be unethical, but doesn't mean it wasn't important or valid? I want to agree. That is a troubling question. I think it's worth recognizing that science is fundamentally an amoral activity. It is about producing more knowledge, more robust, integrated knowledge of the natural world. That said, neither I nor anyone thinks that science should be permitted to go forward without ethical constraints. Just like, think of any sporting activity. The point is not to realize ethical goods. The point is to achieve certain goals within the context of a sporting activity. But we put constraints on those rules, constraints on those activities, precisely for ethical reasons. Someone asked another question just about my general working environment. How is U.S. Defense linked to research? Do you have your own health research ethics committee? So the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research is one of a couple of different health research institutes funded and operated by the U.S. Department of Defense. We do not conduct any biological weapons research, any biological weapons defense research at my institute. It is all health research that have both civilian and military applications. The military interest, of course, being that the U.S. has an interest in keeping its soldiers and military personnel as healthy as possible when operating in different parts of the world. We do operate an institutional review board, which covers research that we conduct in the United States and research that we conduct with our partners in Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast and Central Asia.
Fantastic. I don't know if anyone else has got another question, but if I can ask one last one of you if possible.
Sure.
I was really interested in the potential cross, international database, if you like, of wrongdoing or research waste because of the consequential and sequential nature of one wrong paper, as you say, because lots of the research is N equals 2030 with significant impact. I was just wondering, can you see there being a blacklist and what that would mean, or using AI technology to look at the impact of that particular paper through citations or anything? Because that's a big job for someone to actually look at that and the impact.
It's a very big job. I hope that one thing that this conceptual framework helps with is by pulling in to the discussion about research integrity, which still, at least in the United States, and from what I can tell in other places as well, is still very much focused on individual researcher behaviors or individual institutional policies, whereas problems related to research waste are really systemic. That we don't have proper funding mechanisms. We don't have proper ways of prioritizing different types of research. Journals don't do enough to ensure that bad research doesn't get published and promulgated, and so we end up wasting all these resources. They're systemic fixes, but because they diminish the productivity and efficiency of science overall, they're definitely integrity concerns. But they're also ethical concerns, precisely because those resources could go to better use, and there is an important to feasible connection between the validity and productivity of research and the value of that research for human beings from an ethical perspective for promoting their rights and well-being. So I'm hopeful that folks will do that work, and that thinking about research integrity in this broader sense that doesn't just focus on individual actors can help to facilitate that. Fantastic.
There's just one question come in. Has any study been published that you've done? Have you actually published on this thus far?
Not yet. This is a manuscript in progress. So hopefully you'll be seeing it at some point in 2023.
Oh, that's fantastic. Really appreciate that. Perhaps just before I leave, maybe we should use the integrity definition I keep seeing on LinkedIn by C.S. Lewis. And the sign of integrity is doing the right thing when no one's looking. I think that not necessarily as high tech as yours, but it's an interesting concept nevertheless.
Yeah, I think so.
Fantastic. If no one else has got any other questions, I would like to thank you very much for your time, and happy Thanksgiving. And I hope your turkey isn't too dry today. We really appreciate your time. Thank you very much. And for all the other